just touched on briefly the hybrid reports, the 1004s. What about maybe talking about the current 1004 and 1004 hybrid desktop and 1004 hybrid? What's the difference? Let's touch on that topic a little bit, and maybe you can enlighten us a little bit. What's the difference in those right now? What can we see coming? Can you touch on that a little bit for me?
Sure, sure. Well, the 1004 desktop and hybrid, those concepts have been piloted for a number of years now. And coming out of COVID around that time, the federal regulator over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac said, here's a requirement. You need to have some sort of desktop option. And so they put out the 1004 desktop, very soon followed by the 1004 hybrid. And those were in software really before they actually began doing those. And so the desktop has a very specific scenario use case where it relates to certain purchases, certain transactions specifically. And this is where the appraiser literally sits at their desktop. That's all they do. They don't go out to the property. They don't drive out to the comps and things like this. So again, this tends to be lower risk. So it has to qualify for certain parameters before it's even offered to an appraiser for a 1004 desktop appraisal. And really what the appraiser does is researches as much as possible. So the idea of starting it on purchases was because generally with purchases, appraisers have an MLS record to look at. So there's something to work with, right? Because the appraiser can't just make up what is the condition of the property and make up what are the characteristics of the property. So the appraiser, when they're offered, and if they accept that order, they are expected to have a scope of work that's very limited, and it's at the desk, and they're doing the research. So they're doing the normal research, looking at county records, looking at any sort of available information and the MLS information. And there's been a big push out there for real estate agents to use different types of apps and software and different features that their MLS may have, to where we will be seeing, and I think we are already seeing, more types of scans of the property, better summaries in some cases anyway of what the characteristics are of the property. We have 3D tours and things like that. So the idea being it's low risk, as long as the appraiser has enough information. And that's always the caveat. If there are questions and there's issues, there's inconsistencies that can't be resolved, because appraisers do reconcile data all the time. We see this, we need to figure out which is most reliable. Sometimes it's sort of too far. And so the appraiser may go back and say, you know what, there is just too much contradictory information here. This really needs to be upgraded to a full 1004, a URAR. So that's the desktop. And the hybrid is where there has been a formal property data collection. So there has been someone who has received some sort of training for how to collect data, mainly how to use an app oftentimes to scan a property, collect the data, what's the flooring, what are the walls, do I see this, do I see that? And then that is shuffled off to the lender evaluates it, and then they get it to an appraiser if they need a 1004 hybrid. And then it really becomes very similar to the desktop. Really, hybrid is a type of desktop, although they keep them very separate in forms and things like this at the GSEs. But the appraiser sits at their desk, and they use that data collection along with any of the other typical data sources, current, old MLSs, the county record, aerial, things like this, and they perform the appraisal in that way. So these are not appropriate for every single scenario out there. And we can think of these forms really as interim forms. They very much look nearly identical to the 1004, the typical URAR. We actually train different appraisers and groups and associations. A lot of the time we'll provide a 1 or 2 hour seminar where we take a look at the differences in these forms, because there are some pre-printed differences related to scope of work, related to the assumptions being made, related to the data sources that are expected. And so we still need to think of these, though, as interim forms. These are not going to be around very long. We'll be moving to that new URAR with the expanded data set, the expanded UAD data set, which really will give us one report to rule them all. I mean, you can think of it that way. It's one report, and it has flexibilities in scope. It has disclosure flexibilities to where you can say what your scope was, who did what dates did these things occur on, and things like this. So it can fulfill really that entire spectrum that we talk about now when we look at GSE policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I feel like the overall theme here is going to be consistency and efficiency, essentially across the board. That's what it's giving, which
Yes.
makes sense. And to your point earlier when we spoke, change isn't always bad. So consistency, more efficiency, some situations are going to create lower risk. I believe all those things are important, especially in this industry. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this clip from our Value Update series with Josh Wallet. Stay tuned for next clip when we jump into some URAR discussions. Hopefully gives you some useful information to take with you. Remember, if there's a topic that you'd like to hear more about, feel free to let us know and we'll get to it in a future series.